Good evening and welcome to the New York Symposium with Diane Sayre. I'm Diane Sayre. I'm an independent LaRouche candidate now for U.S. Senate in 2024. And this evening, we are going to be discussing in particular the role of Turkey, or Turkiya as it's now known, and within Europe as a whole. We have really an extremely fast-moving, fast-changing political situation typified by a few things. And I'll say first, I know last week I reviewed the document that Helga Zepp-LaRouche had put out calling for 10 principles of a new international security and development architecture. And I think this evening you'll get a sense of why it is so important that we move to the realm of principle. Certain fundamental ideas. What is the nature of man? What is the nature of sovereignty, which must be respected? What does it mean for nations to have agreements where everyone's sovereignty and security interests are treated equally? And then, having done that, can we address the major issues facing the world, which is the fact that 2 billion people on this planet do not have clean drinking water? We have hundreds of millions of people threatened with death by starvation. We have currently, because of the bankrupt policies of the City of London, Wall Street, NATO, and the intelligence agencies, a very real danger of potential thermonuclear war or other kinds of species annihilating wars, chemical and biological warfare, for example. So how do we pull mankind back from the brink? What should be the dialogue, the principles by which nations make these agreements? And I'll just say, in part, the new paradigm is represented by the visit of Chinese leader Xi Jinping to Saudi Arabia, where he's meeting with dozens of heads of state from Southwest Asia to discuss mutual benefit development projects, not only oil exports from Saudi Arabia, but investments that China can make in building modern infrastructure and allowing nations to liberate themselves from merely being producers of petroleum. And I think this is very interesting because many of us know that Saudi Arabia has played a questionable role, to say the least, in the region. It has not been a paragon of human rights or virtuous policies. But if you're talking about ending a horrible period of war, if you look back to the Treaty of Westphalia, at a certain point after, and religious wars are very brutal and very bloody, and during the 100 years of religious warfare, the 30 years which were ended by the Treaty of Westphalia, hideous crimes and atrocities were committed. And in today's era, we would say we must have revenge, we must get even, they must be punished. And that kind of attitude creates the conditions where you can have ever escalating war. This doesn't mean to say that hideous crimes should be tolerated. But at a certain point, after 4 years of negotiations, people realized that if they did not want the next generations to know nothing but war, that they were going to have to draw a line, in effect, and not look back, and define a new relationship where each nation acted in the interest of the other. And this was accompanied by packages for economic development and debt forgiveness. So I think this is something very important. Americans may or may not be aware that Tony Blair, former Prime Minister of the UK, arrogantly declared that the era of the Treaty of Westphalia is over. We should forget it. Now, if you take the British approach of divide and conquer, having nations relate to each other on win-win cooperation is definitely not the way to go. So Saudi Arabia, Turkiya, and over a dozen other nations have now applied to join the BRICS, to become part of a new paradigm which is not tied to this bankrupt, dying empire. The problem, and why I've announced my candidacy again so soon is that the United States has to come to play a positive role in the world as our founders intended when we had a revolution against the British Empire. Now, on the negative and very dangerous side, as people might be aware, on December 6th, there were drones carrying bombs, which struck deep inside Russia, 500 kilometers inside Russia on military bases. These were carried out by Ukraine, but it is hypothesized or maybe known by a retired Colonel Douglas McGregor, who was interviewed a couple nights ago by Judge Napolitano, that this could not have been done without the CIA and or British intelligence. We also have the text message. Don't forget that Liz Truss in her very brief few days as Prime Minister of the UK sent to the US Secretary of State Tony Blinken just minutes after the Nord Stream pipelines were blown up, which said it is done. So what you have now is an extremely dangerous situation where President Putin has basically had to alter his expressed determination, what Russia has in writing since even last June, that Russia would never launch a first strike nuclear attack, that they would only use nuclear weapons in the event of an existential threat to their nation or a nuclear strike. Now, this is shifting, and a colleague of mine, Steve Starr, who's been on this program, who is somewhat of an expert on what nuclear war would look like, sent a note, which I'm just going to read to give you a sense of his thoughts on this. He said, according to Colonel Douglas McGregor, Putin has revoked the Russia policy of no first use of nuclear weapons, which is a response to Biden signing off on the US using nuclear weapons against conventional forces, as well as US buildup of nuclear-capable aircraft in Europe, as well as the US carrier battle group in the Adriatic Mediterranean that also has nuclear weapons. McGregor states that the new Russian policy is that Russia will strike first with nuclear weapons if Russia believes the US is preparing to attack Russia with nuclear weapons. This is truly a hair trigger on nuclear war. Any false alert of nuclear attack believed to be true will result in nuclear war between the US and Russia. Also, Russian air bases that house long-range Russian nuclear bombers and nuclear weapons were hit with long-range drones a few days ago. The head of the Russian delegation in Vienna on military security issues said that NATO members had a hand in Kiev's provocations against Russian airfields. And the facts indicate this. According to him, the drones used to attempt to strike at airfields were modernized with the participation of an American corporation, and GPS, that's American, was used for guidance. McGregor says the CIA and NSA were definitely involved in this drone attack. I won't read more. Now, also in this interview, Judge Napolitano brings up the fact that our Secretary of State, Tony Blinken, told the Wall Street Journal that the United States public policy, in other words, before any negotiation, the United States policy is that Russian troops have to return to the pre-February 24th border, which means they are totally out of Ukraine, excepting Crimea, which of course is part of the Russian Federation now. I don't know if that means we would recognize that. He asked McGregor, how realistic is this? And Colonel McGregor says, well, if his intention is to ensure there can be no negotiations, then he succeeded, because that's unacceptable to the Russians. Perhaps that's the reason he did it. Now, that's Blinken speaking. We also got a report today, interestingly, from Italy, where the Deputy Secretary of State, Wendy Sherman, has been traveling, and an Italian parliamentarian, Michele Garacci, said that he had an exchange with her, which he characterized as being very, very interesting. He put on Twitter, "Yesterday I had the confirmation that even for the US, Crimea can stay under Russia. It won't be a negotiation issue between the USA and Russia," unquote. Also, people like Mark Milley in the United States have called for negotiations. I think it's dawning on some people that if you have a position from the US and the UK that says Russia cannot be allowed to win, but it is the Russian position historically and of necessity for their legitimate security concerns that they simply cannot lose. They cannot have a Nazi-infested, NATO-armed regime on their border that is carrying out ethnic cleansing against groups of the population and threatening Russia. So they cannot afford to lose. That you have a collision course, which is extremely dangerous. Now, Helga Zepp-LaRouche was quite optimistic, while not being unaware of the extreme danger, I would say, was quite optimistic that with this new paradigm coming into being, that we have a potential to avert such a crisis. And I wanted to have this discussion tonight because I think one nation that's playing a very interesting role in this is Turkey, in terms of helping to create the conditions for talks to find a pathway out of this crisis. So I have two guests joining me. We'll first be hearing from Jacques Cheminade, who is the president of Solidarité et Progrès, the party in France affiliated with Lyndon LaRouche. He will be followed by Mr. Ibrahim Kurtulus, who is a Turkish-American community activist in New York, whom I consider a dear friend. And then we'll be opening it up for discussion. And let me just say that, as always, participation in this symposium does not constitute endorsement of a political campaign. And it is the case that I may not always agree with the views of my guests, but it is urgent in this age of censorship that we have the opportunity to have a fair and open dialogue. So with that, I will turn to Mr. Cheminade.
Good night, and thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to an American audience. And it's very important to organize something good coming from the United States at this point, where there are a lot of doubts in the whole world about that. And you, Diane, represent this potential goodness in the United States in the context of the whole American history since the American independence and revolution. So the world is undergoing two processes: a short-term process who leads us towards war and economic disintegration, chaos. A second process, which is a long-term process, is the process going in the west, in the east and the south of the world, which is a process towards a new world, more just monetary and financial orders, and I would say cultural orders also. So these two processes, one demands from us to stop the war, danger, and the other one to build the peace. And to be against the war is not enough. We have to create the conditions for the peace. It is in that context that the Turkish party Vatan invited us to come to the Congress. The Congress was dedicated to the memory of Admiral Soner Polak, who was the head of their intellectual commitment towards the tradition of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. So Vatan defines itself as a party of the reason, of science, and the transformation of society for the good. In that sense, it's why they invited us. They were the only person invited from France, because they thought that we were thinking in the same direction, and meeting their people, meeting their leader, who is a candidate for the Turkish presidency, and which is Dogu Perinçek, who was always also, like Admiral Polak, being jailed in the past. It has to be understood in the process, jailed in the past, but Erdogan and the tribunals in Turkey. They were jailed in 2012 and freed in 2014 because Erdogan understood that he cannot confront frontally the Turkish army and the tradition of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. So they were freed, and then when they were freed and Erdogan took a rather different direction in his policy, then there was a coup organizing by NATO and in particular by the famous imam who is teleguided from the United States, the famous imam Fethullah Gulen, the Gulenists. So they almost killed Erdogan. He escaped from the coup. And then what people of Vatan are saying, there is a positive thing happened, that before it was our friends, the people who represent the genuine interests of Turkey, our military friends who were in jail. Now they are freed, and Erdogan had to put the people from Gladio and the people from the NATO in jail. So we are free. We are not endorsing Erdogan as such. We have our own presidential candidate. But we think that we can manage to put pressure on one side on the present government of Turkey to go more in the direction of Southwest Asia, what they call Southwest Asia, which is a policy of the BRICS, the policy of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and which is a policy of the Economic Eurasian Union. So this is their stand. They said, Perinček said in his speech, that for him, Turkey should undergo a new revolution, which would be in the context of all the intentions, whatever the results were after, all the intentions of all the genuine revolutions. The French Revolution, he said, the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution, and the Chinese Revolution. And he said the common denominator is that all were against colonialism and imperialism. So this is key for us. That's why we want to get rid of NATO and get rid of those people that manipulate us. Instead, we want Erdogan to go more fully into the new development in the world. In that sense, they were extremely interested by the Schiller Institute and the French party Solidarité et Progrès, because what they say is that we're ashamed to see what France is becoming, and I'm ashamed too, what the role that France should play in the world should be, together with Turkey and probably China, a role of mediator in the present conflict in Europe and in the whole world. For that, we need to have a new world economic order, a new architecture, as Helga Zebla-Rouge, the president of the Schiller Institute International, says, a new architecture which would give to every country in the world, without exception, stability, security, and common development. So this is in the context or in the view of the Peace of Westphalia, which says we forgive the offenses and we forgive what we did in the past. We decide to play the advantage of the other meaning we do all the good that we can do for the other to establish the conditions of peace, and we don't expect a reward. We think that normally it will establish at a higher level a combination of forces that would create the conditions for peace. This is, in that sense, was in the Peace of Westphalia already what Nicolas de Cusa says, and the concept of the coincidence of the opposites that we defend. We don't create the conditions for peace with your friends. You're already a friend. We need to create something which was our opponents or enemies at a higher level, at the level where you are. This is our policy, is the policy of the Schiller Institute. By the way, French generals participate to the meetings of the Schiller Institute, in particular, General de Lavarde, who is a close friend of MacGregor. So it's very interesting that there is this transatlantic bridge. It's also very interesting in the discussions with the Pathan party that they have invited ambassadors. There were ambassadors of China, Russia, Algeria in particular, and also Abkhazia. which was also very interesting, given there is an Abkhazian community in Turkey and in the whole world. So the representative of Russia were closely acquainted with Sergei Glaziev. And when I said what Sergei Glaziev said about Lyndon LaRouche, they immediately completely changed, and they were very happy to see that something in Europe appears in that direction that for them we represent. So in that sense, the tradition of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk is very lively. People in the room, there were 700 delegates and 11,000 people in the sports place of Ankara. It was in Ankara. So these people were shouting, "We are the soldiers of Mustafa Kemal." And one of the members told me, "We are more than citizens, we are soldiers, because in this moment of history, we need this bridge between the military and the population." So in terms of Turkey, the military are mostly, not all of them, but mostly in the tradition of Mustafa Kemal. Alors, Mustafa Kemal was the father of the Republic and the father of a policy where he gave voting rights to the woman, well before France, by the way, and he gave also a sense of the nation linked to this economic development. And it was, in a sense, not perfect, but was in a sense in the direction of the physical economy and involving all the population. I was in Turkey in 1971, and what impressed me the most was in the middle of Anatolia, in a road far from a village, at least at, about 2 or 3 kilometers, there were 3 little girls going to school together, and they were walking towards school. So the schooling was a key point in the Turkish policy. And this is also an extremely, let's say, identity of the nation. This is the way towards perfecting the quality of the population. So in that sense, Vatan, they invited us to see the meeting with the delegates also, not only the meeting in the sporting place where there were 11,000 people, but also from all Turkey. They were coming from all Turkey, but also in the meeting room of the hotel where there were 700 delegates. So we had very interesting discussions. There were people representing them in France. And to tell you 2 anecdotes that would better understand what they are. First, there, Odile starts speaking with 2 young people in the bus because we went to the Museum of the Anatolian Civilization, which is something very important for them, and rightly so, because it was a cradle for the development of civilization, East and West in that part of the world, and probably also in Europe through Greece. So they are conscious that there is a potential brotherhood with Greece, not with the Greek government, with the present Greek government, but with Greece as such. So they said we should avoid a war with them. That's very important, and we should establish the more you can to avoid a provocation to get a new Balkans war. So that's one thing. The second is that we start speaking about humanists that represented the tradition of the best in European history. So Odile mentioned Rabelais, the French author Rabelais, and they knew it. There was a young guy, about 20, who started smiling and said, yes, Rabelais, Gargantua, and the Pico-Colin Wars to solve the conflicts. You needed a higher form of solution. So it was terrible for me in that sense, because I was extremely happy to see that an English-speaking person, he could not speak French, he had not learned French, but he knew Rabelais through the English language. So that was also already extremely interesting. But I was really ashamed to see that in France, people would know less about Rabelais than him. So we have lost that in our country. And this is what we're fighting to reestablish, this sense of a culture where you would educate the population for the best in the advantage of all. Also, the second thing that was for me extremely impressive was that in the discussions, what they see is the potential. They see not the situation as fixed, but as a potential and as transformation. The General Secretary Osgur Boursaleux, he said, we have to organize the whole nation. We have to be at the same time in solidarity with the whole nation. We should listen to people, but we have our president, and we should work hard to make the ideas of our president and our party being shared by the population. So in that sense, they have the candidate for the presidency, Dogu Perinçek, but at the same time, they got a message of sympathy from Erdogan. Erdogan has to, let's say, take in consideration what they are, because the elections of June in Turkey are not very clear. They are, in fact, a party which pretends to be the inheritor of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, and which is not, is infected by certain liberal aspects of Anglo-American ideology. So they say that they represent the true inheritance of Mustafa Kemal. It was impressive to see also in the room that they had theater representations. So they represented the power of the army against imperialisms. They represented ships from the United States, but also of France, as being in the context of imperialism, and also a small Greek flag. So they said, we are fighting that because we see that these people are infected by ideas, which are the ideas of imperialism, colonialism, that we fight. That was one thing. Then delegations of all Turkey coming and have representations of their productions, various productions in Turkey, wheat, agriculture, all the production in the construction area, all the production for the industry, etc. There are all that representing on the stage. So in that sense, they represent a true spirit of the nation. And I think it's extremely powerful to tell that in France, where the spirit of the nation is at loss. So it's not obviously the only example in the world, but it's very important. The second important thing is that we speak to people like this in Turkey. We speak to other people also in Turkey, but we speak in particular with this party. And at the same time, we speak to people in Greece that are also in favor of the new world economic order. Leonidas Christopopoulos, for example, which is a friend of ours, former Greek ambassador, and very active in Greek policies. So in both cases, the possibility to get together is something that has to be out of the Anglo-American and domination and European submission today, and has to be something which creates the conditions where peace should be reached, even if there are oppositions, notably in the status of Cyprus between the Greeks and the Turks. But it could be if they see in the future, with the eyes of the future, and not the feuds in the present. So on that, I find that these people in the Vatan party are very conscious, and they think that the Balkans war should be avoided at any cost. And also they see in the Peace of Westphalia and the 5 principles of Bandung and the 5 principles of Pacific coexistence of Bandung and the 10 principles of the conference, they see that as something that the Ataturk tradition represent, and they should be in acquaintance with that tradition. So I found this very interesting because it's in coherence with what we fight for. The other thing, which Helga Sepp-Larouche underlined many times, and me too, is that if this is seen as the West against the rest, as they say, or if this is seen as a new system against France and against Europe and against the United States, it doesn't work. We need a multipolar world today, but we need in this multipolar world a unity, which would be a unity in the coincidence of the opposites, which would be that the whole world is not divided in blocks, in because if it's divided in blocks, it means at some point war. So our work in France, we work in the United States, our work in the whole Atlantic world, let's call it that way, should be a fight to establish this bridge between what we are doing and what the world with the world of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the world of the BRICS, and the world of the European, the Eurasian Economic Union, what they are doing. And we need this combination. And this combination, let's say, is for her the challenge, is for us to challenge, the challenge is to change things inside our countries. So in that sense, more and more people that would never have spoken to me before are now speaking to me to see what I meant before. And for the first time in France, they are interested in Lyndon LaRouche, because before they said Lyndon LaRouche is an American bird. So at this point, they're interested in what he wrote, and they see him at the same time as a genuine American patriot and a world citizen, and a genuine world citizen. And in that sense, there is an interest, a growing interest in what we are doing. We're establishing, we have our party, Solidarité et Progrès, of course, the international discussions of the Schiller Institute, where this French military and French acquainted with the, let's say, the institutions of the presidency were there. The head of the fusion project in France, which is a world project in southern France, was there. He spoke at our conference. Now, unfortunately, he passed away, but he spoke at our conference, which impressed a lot of people. We have the head, a former head of the EDF, which is the main electricity producer, the only electricity producer really in France, which supports us. And we have also the citizen circles, which is people that don't want to be directly involved in politics, but want to think what the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests, did not do to be a force in the nation. They want to see what they can put together to get out of their exclusion from politics, because these yellow vests were in an insurrection against the cost, in particular, of gasoline. And they were an insurrection because they need to work with their cars, because the way where they live and the way where they work are most of the time far, because it costs too much to live where the place where the production is. So these people were in a state of rebellion. Now the situation is much worse. The price of electricity in certain firms in France has increased 10 times, 15 times, 20 times. So a lot of firms are closing door, locking out for 4, 3 months, 7 months, who knows? So you have a situation in Europe where we are going towards a very profound crisis in these following months. This gives us a lot of credibility because people understand that we have said the truth about what was going to happen. We have a lot of people now coming to our office to discuss with us what has to be done. So both these things happening in France and these things happening with our 3-day trips in Ankara show are elements, they're only elements, but they're elements of a change in politics for the good. So it exists. It is like you can see in the United States. It does exist, and it represents potentially what is absolutely necessary for our respective countries. So the message sent by Sergei Gaziev for the 100th anniversary of Lynn, of his birth, is very, very important because people consider that, and they also consider that he made this tweet praising Elga for her 10 principles that she opened up for discussion. And he said it's a very good bridge towards what has to be done. So it's very interesting to see this change. And I think our American audience should understand that this change is for good and that we are committed to make it work from Turkey and what Turkey represents as a potential mediator and a tradition of the West inside the Southwest Asia, and what they see as the Anatolian civilization. I was at the Museum of the Anatolian Civilization, which they see as something beyond and above even the Turkey, which is really what not all of them, but some of them see as a profound commitment of the country to world history in the past and has to be revived in the future. So I want to give this sense to your audience.
Okay, well, thank you so much. So I'm going to introduce Mr. Kurtulus, and I'm sorry earlier to just for 1 minute, I just want to show the map because he, being Turkish-American, has some very particular vantage points. And I think, unfortunately, Americans tend to be a little bit limited in their knowledge of this part of the world. So I'm just going to put this up here for a second so you can see one where the Black Sea is, and you can see down in the corner what this represents in the world as a whole, really a total crossroads between Africa, Southwest Asia, Russia, Europe. That's why it's been very important to the British and others to keep war there perpetually. And you can see right across the Black Sea is Ukraine, Odessa, an important city, Crimea right here. Okay, and then over to this area, you can see Greece. So if you think from the standpoint of the divide and conquer game, this is a sensitive heartland with many nations close together, which has therefore great potential for collaboration, but also has many threads to be pulled by people who wish to stir up conflict. So I'll now turn it over to Mr. Kurtulus, and thank you.
One word before that. Another thing is that the Turks have still in mind that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Jupiter, the American Jupiter missiles were near Izmir. You're going to see Izmir in this map. So they were in Turkey, and Kennedy decided to dismantle them after Khrushchev dismantled its own missiles in Cuba. So this means the advantage of the other on both sides. And I think it's very important that they have a sense of it.
Okay, thank you. Now, Mr. Kurtulus, please. Thank you for being patient, and go ahead.
Thank you, Diane. It's a great honor and privilege to be with you and to give voice to a very important country of the most chaotic region of the world. So most of our fellow Americans don't know where District of Columbia is. So I'm going to give a little brief description of where Turkey, and this is the new name, by the way, where the old name was Turkey. The new name is Turkey, and since the Cold War. So let me start by saying that Turkey is not our grandfather's Turkey anymore. Turkey of the 21st century is likely to be profound and I think different from the 21st century, but also still following the leader, the creator of the Republic of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, as he said, peace at home, peace in the world, is regarded as a central principle of the state administration and any state activities. And the statement really refers to peace and comfort domestically, as well as international peace and security. This principle is the fundamental basis of domestic and foreign policies since the creation of the Republic of Turkey. So Turkey has been growing and participating in a new international economy and post-Cold War diplomacy. As the world economy becomes integrated with unprecedented speed, as Jack had mentioned, and intensifying intensity, countries around, such as Turkey, are finding that they have little choice but to adapt their economies and policies based on the imperatives of new global systems. After years of hesitations since the Cold War, I think Turkey has finally started to take steps in a new direction. And it has eliminated some of the state's central economic policies, and I think has taken steps to bring its domestic political structure in line by calling for more diversified on international structure, and I think has started to practice a more active and effective foreign policy, both in the Middle East and on the world stage. I think the Republic of Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk's Turkey, if we have to look at how far it has come in the last 99 years, and next year will be the centennial 100 year of the creation of this very interesting country. In the last 25 years, I think it has finally taken off its straitjacket that the West had put them in. It's been making great achievements on behalf of humanity. I think the region, the past, and I think the future also. It is going to, I personally think, become the country of truly quiet revolutions. And I think Turkey's mindset, its influence, Turkey's stand in spreading the waves through the Balkans and having a non-discriminating position against Africa, Mideast, Central Asia, and South Asia, right to the steps of its blood brother country of South Korea. I think when we continue to look at, Turkey, I think is becoming the mindset of the 21st century, as for years now, President Erdogan has been saying in the UN that the world is larger than five. And he's been referring to this, referring to the permanent representatives UN Security Council, saying that it needs to expand because the world has definitely changed. And as Jack said, change is very important. And I think Turkey has been leading that charge at the UN also. I think Turkey is becoming, honestly, in my opinion, the 21st century surprise country. Turkey continues to, and will meet the 21st century's expectations. And I think Turkey is the 21st century's conscience, from its strategic mindset to humanitarian sensibilities, and, from preparing for the future and the experience from the knowledge and gained from the past, as I think Jack mentioned also, from the Anatolian rise to regional awareness around it, from compassion and its soft power through its political and diplomatical stands. And I think as it is traveling and influencing through continents in transforming history and standing up for justice. And I think for now, nearly all of its 74 years as a state, Turkey has kept a low profile in that period of time. I personally think, those days are over for Turkey. And I think now Turkey is reaching for high ambitions as a welcoming power by many in taking a regional role as an arbitrator and peacemaker. I think in October, the Israeli defense minister, when he was in Ankara, said Turkey has become a global player. And I definitely agree with that. As a Muslim secular country, ultimately familiar with the region around it, I think Turkey can go places and has gone places as engaged partners, and I think has made deals that even the United States or others that cannot and have not or couldn't. And today we see that in Ukraine, in the Ukrainian war, and I think Ankara has pioneered peace diplomacy in this particular war between Moscow and Kiev. And I think that will set an example for the world. I think peace diplomacy that Turkey has demonstrated since the break of the Ukrainian war, in the Russian and Ukrainian war, has shown that the whole world accepts Turkey as a stabilizing and I think as a smoothing power that contributes to global peace, while strongly defending Ukrainians' territorial integrity, but staunchly opposing and fueling tension in the region, with irrational policies, I think, towards Russia or anyone in that region. I feel Turkey with bitter experiences that internal interventions in the region, from, as we've seen, in the Middle East to the Balkans, and what we're seeing perhaps in Kosovo unfolding, from the Black Sea to the Eastern Mediterranean, honestly do not result in anything but then exaggerating or creating more crises and creating tragedies where the net loss is women and children losing, and families losing, and countries being dragged into war and being pushed back, 50 to 100 years because of ones who have alternative motives. I think Turkey, honestly, exercising its rotating influence I personally think will, continue to benefit the region around it and beyond, to prevent global polarization and prevent a new Cold War, especially around it. Turkey has had enough of wars around it, and as it's playing this new role, I think it continues to be, and as it continues, I think, being a member in the bedrock of Western structures, as in having the second most powerful and respected military in that part of the world, and Council of Europe, ones who may have decisions on saying that Turkey is moving more to the east. I think this is a fact and attests to Turkey's inherent affiliation with the West. And I think Turkey has been a strong and reliable ally to the West, and I think to the East too, as that bridge. And I see that continuing to develop. And as a bulwark of Western defense alliances, I think for the last 75 years, and a fellow defender of democracy, and especially in the Korean War, and then in the Balkans, and in Bosnia, Kosovo, Somalia, Libya, and just recently as in Azerbaijan. I personally think, Turkey continues and deserves our goodwill and support more than ever. And I think Turkey's dynamic and multi-directional foreign policy, especially in the last 22 years under this current administration in Ankara, I personally think asserted itself somewhat convincingly, as a determined and powerful and independent actor in the epicenter of the vast and most troubled region of the world. And I personally think that this Turkish role will continue to hold tantalizing potential as days move forward. As a matter of fact, as I mentioned before, in October, Israeli Defense Minister said Turkey has now, reached that point of no returning back as a powerful player on the world stage, and I definitely agree with that. And I think there's more to see, and we see that in the role that she's playing with Ukraine, Diane.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's important. I wanted to ask both of you to respond, and maybe yes, all of us can be here for discussion, because someone, Greek American, and I want you to tell me why this is being said, where it comes from, who says, how can Turkey play a peacemaker role? What about the illegal weapons in northern Cyprus? All the UN resolutions are against the illegal occupation of Cyprus for 48 years, etc. It seems like there's really an effort to stoke things up here. And I think, Mr. Kurtulus, you might want to respond, and then Jacques, I'd like to get your thoughts on it.
Unfortunately, for the last 30, 40 years, ones with such commentary have nothing but a smear campaign attached to their comments. The fact of the matter is, what this gentleman is forgetting about is that the Republic of Cyprus was founded in 1960 and was designed to guarantee the equal rights of two ethnicities, religiously and culturally distinct people on the island. But in 1963, the Greek Cypriots forced out Turkish Cypriots from a joint institution of the Republic of Cyprus, destroying a young republic. In 1974, and this is a matter of record, in 1974, the military coup that happened inside Greece, and they attempted to overthrow the Cyprus government and tried to annex the island, which obligated Turkey as a guarantor party, a guarantor power under 1960 Treaty of Guarantees to intervene and protect the Turkish Cypriot population. And since the other two guarantor powers of UK and Greece decided against a joint intervention, Turkey was left all alone to act in its own interest to protect its people and other Turkish citizens there. The gentleman talks about weapons on the island. I think he is neglecting to also talk about Greek weapons on the island, Greek military personnel on the island since the early formation of the Republic of Cyprus. The fact of the matter is, since Turkey intervened on the island, there has been peace on the island. There hasn't been any bloodshed on the island. Turkey for years have been calling for a solution on the island. And we know this just as recently where the Annan plan, the UN peace plan that then UN Secretary General Kofi Annan put on the table, better than 85% of Turkish Cypriots voted to reunite the island. But we have seen over and over and over again, and I'm not going to go into all of the resolutions and all of other plans since 1974, where the Greek Cypriots have rejected peace on the island. So I think the gentleman needs to put aside his smear campaign and look at the facts on the ground and look at what the first president of Cyprus said. Turkey did not invade Cyprus. The first Greek Cypriot president said Turkey intervened to protect its interests. And honestly, by Turkey intervening in Cyprus, indirectly kind of restored democracy in Greece also, that this gentleman is forgetting about. It's clear the message that this gentleman is putting forward has alternative motives, smear campaign, and we've heard it over and over again.
Jacques, what thoughts do you have?
British. Blame the British instead of thinking of feuds from the past or things like that. The British policy has always been divide to rule. And blame also the Americans when their mind become British. So, and then you make a step forward and think what you can do with the best of the American history and the best of European history and the best of the history in both countries. And remember, for the Greeks, that the British organized after 1945 the civilian war to pit the so-called communists against the so-called Democrats in Greece, and they organized a horror of the civilian war in Greece. So the Greeks should look what they have tried to do with themselves, and that in Turkey also people should think about this British problem. I think that one thing that impressed them the most from what I told them is what I admire is when Mustafa Kemal Atatürk defeated the Churchill invasion in the Dardanelles. And Mustafa Kemal Atatürk that day put the Turkey, the Republic of Turkey, in the direction towards the future.
I agree, Jack. I just want to bring out another fact that this gentleman who asked the question has neglected to look into in depth. In March 21, this is a court, Athens Court of Appeals decision, March 21, 1975. The court's decision read as follows. I can't remember the whole deal. I'll just give you a brief note. The Turkish intervention in Cyprus, which was carried out in accordance with the London and Zurich agreements, or the guarantor of powers agreement, was legal. Turkey had, as a guarantor of power, had the full right and obligation to intervene to stop the bloodshed of so many Turkish citizens, Turkish Cypriots, being literally butchered. And the true guilty ones here were the Greek officials, or Onessa terrorist organization, who organized the coup, and the Greek officers in Greece, by therefore creating conditions for that intervention that Turkey created. And since today, we've had peace on the island. Both sides have peace. And I think the gentleman should really put aside spoon-fed distorted information and really go back and read what the first president, who was a Greek Cypriot, said about the intervention. As he said at the United Nations, that Turkey did not create an occupation on the island. Turkey intervened because it had the obligation to do so.
Well, I think, again, I'm going to go back to this map here. I have another map because I think we really have to think of the potential and whose interest is it. I mean, as you may know, the Europeans and the European Central Bank did something very foolish if they're trying to stop the development of China's initiative, the Belt and Road. And this is the Schiller Institute proposal for development of the region, which is that they insisted that in order for Greece to pay its debt, it had to sell the port of Piraeus, and Costco of China purchased this or got a long-term agreement for the port in Greece, which has opened up a new, I think you can see my cursor, it's opened up a new, really extraordinary sea route, which actually can save a lot of time for various transportation routes. And then you have this, which let's see if I can go back, just to show people the grain deal, which was negotiated largely by Turkey and the United Nations to allow grain to come out through the Bosphorus Straits, and this route here, that this is really important for the development of mankind and for eradicating poverty. And again, I think it's very ironic because the Europeans, not the Europeans, but the British, the US, the people who want this perpetual war order, first force Greece to sell off its port. Then they're very unhappy when China purchases it and ends up massively increasing the trade and productivity in the region. So you can imagine they would greatly want to disrupt this. If you look at what has happened as a result of the sanctions, the war policy, what's happened to food supply, what's happened to energy supply, it's a big question for me. How long is Europe going to continue thinking the US, NATO, and the UK are their great allies when we blew up the pipeline and we're basically telling people freeze in the dark and go back to burning wood? And I'm not sure this whole thing is actually going to hang together, this European Union, US. Jacques may have a better sense of that. I think the direction, I mean, you look at the role that Turkey is playing, and as I mentioned earlier, Turkey and even Saudi Arabia wanting to join the BRICS. Helga Zeppler-Roush pointed out the Japanese member of the Trilateral Commission, which is a very nasty organization, but nonetheless, the Japanese representative of that said, if you're going to force us to choose between the US, the UK, and China, we're going to choose China. We don't want to be in this bankrupt, broken down, collapsing empire. And I think this is where we really, these principles of acting as one humanity, each with our sovereign nations, each with a certain respect for that, but also recognizing we have to act in the interest of mankind as a whole. And I think you can see from the region and the map, again, the incentive for people to disrupt it, including to disrupt Turkey, as Jacques mentioned, and I know we've discussed, Ibrahim, the Fethullah Gulen people in the United States being deployed to destabilize, disrupt, and create chaos. So
you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, analyzing the region, as I said before we came online, I think I may have mentioned this to Suzanne, to analyze what's going on in the region in 60 minutes is very hard. But yeah, I like to also just say one more thing about that Greek gentleman or young lady, whoever he or she is. She says, how could Turkey be a arbitrator? Well, first of all, Turkey is not pushing itself to be an arbitrator. It's being welcomed as it is in Africa. It's a trusted country, and by African countries and by both sides in Ukraine and Russia. So Turkey is not imposing itself on any country. It's literally being invited. Red carpets are being put down as Turkish diplomats are arriving in certain capitals in the world, because Turkey has maintained a very careful balance, especially in this latest incident in the Russian and Ukrainian instance. As we're heading into the 11th mark now, Turkey has emerged as a major swinging player in this protracted war. Ankara is involved in the conflict on a number of fronts, of security cooperation with Ukraine, to energy cooperation, with Russia, to serving as a diplomatic mediator between the two capitals. Not that it imposed itself, but it's being welcomed. So this Greek gentleman or young lady should really look at the facts before just spoon feeding distorted information into the media or sending messages over to you, Diane.
Well, I have to say one thing that has been really of interest to me. In the 1990s, I was very involved in trying to prevent the mass genocide that broke out in the Great Lakes region of Africa. And as people may know, there was a terrible plane crash that killed the presidents of Rwanda and Burundi. It is very likely that the Ugandan government of Museveni was involved in that, but surely at the instigation of, again, the great Anglo-American, Anglo-Dutch genocide operation. Now, Museveni is playing an interesting role in trying to get cooperation between Africa and China and for economic development. And he has been enough of a problem that he has been added to the same Ukrainian hit list that I myself am on, as an information terrorist and war criminal, which makes me think that he might be playing a useful role. So I think the most dangerous thing is for anyone to presume that the human beings are fixed and cannot change. Because if that's the case, then we really are not going to be able to get out of this crisis. So we're going to have to presume that human beings will find it in their interest to survive and to survive as a species. We're in a world where there's not such a thing as one group of us surviving and the other group getting annihilated. Either we're all going to be annihilated or we're all going to survive. My proposal being that I'm not that old yet, I would like us to survive for quite a bit longer. And I think that young people today should be able to consider living to be 100 years old, becoming geniuses, classical musicians, fluent in many languages, and potentially building cities, building industrial base on the moon. I mean, there's a lot that we have to do. And therefore, we have to figure out a way to get out of these kind of instigated conflicts here. So I think we have to wrap up. I'm just going to ask if you have anything else, Ibrahim, very briefly, and also Jacques, if he has something else, and then we'll close. So go ahead.
Well, I thank you, Diane, for this forum. Getting back to Turkey's position as a mediator, undisputed that Turkey's influence in the Ukrainian matter, Ankara has shown great diplomatic maneuvering as it's condemned Russia, but continue to engage with Russia. And the main issue here has been Ankara's, I think, willingness is for peace and stability as it maintained this balance in avoiding an open conflict with Russia, while demonstrating solidarity with the West and increasing Ankara's regional diplomatic weight. And I think the Turks have done a great job with this. And I personally think, what Turkey has showcased in this particular conflict and over the last 25 years on the Erdogan's administration is a textbook study on how Turkey has taken off its straitjacket and has been invited into the African continent, into the Balkans, in creating and being that balance and having a rotating influence and really not choosing sides, but really bringing stability and to frozen conflicts. And I personally believe that it's a great study that we could, diplomats can really look at on how Turkey has maintained this fine balance over the last, with this conflict and over the last 25 years in the world as it took off its straitjacket.
Great, thank you very much. And Jacques, your thoughts and anything else you want to say also about Europe? Can we get Europe to break?
For Europe, it should get out of the grave and break with all the bad habits that have contaminated our respective countries. Already today, a lot of French people blame Germany because Germany did everything to shut down the nuclear industry in Europe. So they're right. But if they take this issue as something per se, it's suicidal. But they're right on putting the finger on an issue, but they're wrong in not doing what's behind and what happened behind. In that sense, I was very happy when our friends in Turkey brought me to the Ankara train station, which is a very modern train between Ankara and Istanbul, 3 hours. It takes 3 hours. Before it was 6-7 hours. So in front of the station, you have a sculpture of Nasreddin Hoxha. So most of the people don't know Nasreddin Hoxha. It's a figure in the Turkish culture which challenges Genghis Khan in that way, the tyrant, and who does it with jokes, does it with ironies, and does it putting the other to acknowledge its contradictions in what he does. So that's also very important. They have this sense of humor in a country. But at the same time, something other has to be considered, which makes me very optimistic. Somebody called Cervantes was prisoner in Algiers. And when he was prisoner in Algiers, after the Lepanto battle, he knew about Nasreddin Hoxha there. And he brought back the idea and it inspired him the figure of Sancho Panza. So it's very interesting to see how in civilizations, philosophers, writers, poets, artists are the ones that create an orientation towards the good. And I think we should think much more of that within the inspiration of the 10 principles that Elgazep Larouche has thrown for discussion to all of us. And we should look at it much more in depth of the consequences in our minds of what it does to see in terms of the whole humanity, the whole civilization, at the same time that we see in terms of our own countries, patriot and world citizen.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. And I want to tell everybody that we'll be having my new campaign for U.S. Senate in 2024. We'll be having a very important meeting in person in Manhattan on Sunday, January 8th, from 1 to 5 p.m. And the purpose of this meeting is policy discussion. There will be people who are speaking there, some of the retired military and intelligence people that you've seen on my shows, not for the purpose of endorsing my campaign, but to work with the campaign to outline a sane policy for the United States. And I'm hoping we will also have some prominent European voices at this conference, and everyone should set the day aside. So Sunday, January 8th from 1 to 5 p.m. And I will see all of you, provided we can hold off this war escalating. Hopefully we'll all be able to see each other 1 week from today here on the symposium. And